going into the Q&A. We have some questions now. First one for you, Jivan. How much opposition has there been to building heights based on shadows, lack of line of sight to natural resources, scenic views, etc.? I was really surprised how restricted long-range views were the last time I walked in Cambridge a couple of years back. I am in no way opposed to the changes to add more affordable housing, but I have to imagine the new height allowances have caused some consternation amongst residents.
No, absolutely. I think that was a opposition piece to affordable housing overlay, to some other zoning changes we've looked at as well, about sort of the change in development, both in terms of the physical form and what it's going to look like, as well as pieces on if you are adding a bunch more units and that's going to have more people, is it going to lead to more traffic? Where is everyone going to park? And that's why it's really important, I think, to talk about housing creation in addition with transit, which we've been doing a lot of in Cambridge as well. We've added a new cycling safety ordinance that's going to create more protected bike lanes so people can get around the city without cars, added bus lanes so folks will be have incentives to take public transit. That piece is always a challenge though, and I think also sort of relates to feelings around development that sort of stretch back decades even. There are folks in Cambridge who are still here today who were involved in the opposition to highway expansion, which would have gone right through Cambridge and bulldozed whole neighborhoods. And there's feelings, whether they're conscious or not, when folks think about development, they think about that era and this sort of Robert Moses era of expansion, and then they transpose that onto zoning changes, including sometimes even affordable housing. And it's a challenge to try to bring that different context to the situation and talk about why we need more affordable housing, why we need more housing, period. But that is a challenge, I think, in all the sort of development discussions.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. This question, I believe, could go to both of you. The traffic and parking issue feels like an ever-present challenge for this work. It is something opponents of new housing, affordable or not, cling to. It's definitely top of mind here in Providence whenever new development comes up. In fact, we had a contentious meeting about it hosted by the 195 redevelopment district just last night. Wondering if the panelists have any advice, hopes, or dreams of how to transcend this barrier to building housing.
I can jump in. I'm sure both of us have a lot of scars from parking. So, parking is really hard politically, and people get really emotional about it, right? I mean, rightfully, people get emotional about where they live. They get emotional about their community. I think, to me, we are in a cold place with a lot of snow. So the reality is that shifting away from people using automobiles to other modes will be iterative and will take time. And it's also true that a lot of people don't drive, either by choice or by necessity. And that we have dramatically overbuilt our streets, and that we are using really, really prime road area for car storage in parking that could be used for all kinds of other things that people love, like greenery and cafe seating and play space. And that when you really start to talk to people about what they care about and what they want their community to be like, often those other things actually do win out over car parking or storing cars. I think, the crux, housing and transportation are so related. And in order to get the kind of housing that people really want, which it tends to be smaller scale, more flexible in design than like the big parking. I mean, the big box with the parking ramp and housing above, that houses a lot of people. And that is legitimate housing in our city, a lot of our cities, that houses a lot of people. And we also hear that folks like more variety. They want more smaller developments. And in order to do that, you have to shift how you're approaching parking, because you simply physically cannot build underground parking or a parking structure on lots when you get down to a certain size, and or the cost is prohibitive. So we've had huge luck in sort of re-legalizing the kinds of historic buildings that we have very commonly in Minneapolis, I'm sure also in Providence and other places, you know, the 3 or 4 story walk-up. Those aren't legal to build if you are requiring a lot of parking or 1 parking space per unit. When we eliminated parking, it just means that each development decides how much parking it wants in it. And this is, I think, an approach that works really well for an iterative change, because we do have some parking, we do have some buildings that are putting in more than 0.5 parking spaces per unit. And we have a lot of buildings near the University of Minnesota, near really transit-rich corridors that are putting in very little parking. But they're marketing to a certain population. And there are a lot of populations that, again, don't own cars, don't drive every day. So I think it is one way to really phase in over time, but it does require us to actually invest in infrastructure that works for transit, biking, and walking. And we really have not done that, even in cities where we have made progress. We have so far to go to make people feel really, truly safe, to make transit really compete with driving for a lot of trips. I think we have such high biking rates in Minneapolis because our transit is so slow and unpredictable that it's faster to just bike. So that's, to me, like the hugest priority for us as a community in a region, is to really invest in really high quality transit. We're doing it, but it's taking longer than it would if we had more funding. And you know, the political buy-in comes when things start working better. So once we get a really robust transit system that's actually connected, not just 1 or 2 routes, then we start seeing the benefits of the investment and the change.
Thank you, Lisa. Jivan, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that was interesting in the pandemic was to see the creative use of space that had been taken up by parking, that restaurants you were able to use with the support of municipalities to take up spaces there. Sometimes street closures for folks to get exercise, just have more space. We have a big road that goes along the river that is going back decades, has been closed on Sundays for folks to rollerblade and bike and run on. We expanded that to Saturdays and Sundays during the pandemic, and so there's often a push or a concern when parking is taken out, but when folks get to see the possibilities, I think there's some excitement that goes along with that, and hopefully that continues to build. The one other piece that Cambridge has done, and there are folks who are more expert on this than I am, but especially for commercial development, when we've taken away parking minimums, which are great to not require parking, have also looked at a transportation demand management ordinance. So having making places look when they're building at contributing to public transit, adding bike parking, adding bike share pieces for employees and in some cases residents also. So at the same time, if we're taking away parking, also being intentional about looking at how else folks can get around and making companies look into that, and also trying to be proactive about planning about that as a city.
I have another question here for both panelists. The question says, I'm curious if both panelists could speak about their experience with homeowner resistance to zoning and building changes in their neighborhood. I've seen in Providence predictable resistance to upzoning R1 districts to accommodate 3 to 4 or 4 unit buildings. I've also seen lower income neighborhoods resist new build because of fears of gentrification. How did you work to soften fears held by both types of homeowners?
I mean, I think for us, starting with accessory dwelling units and seeing the numbers, even just after a year or two, helped us really talk about how slow change was going to be if we made a shift in our zoning. I mean, building a new detached unit on a single family lot is almost as expensive as building a new single family home, at least in places where you need to have a foundation, which is required under our state building code, probably other cold cities too. Or even, if rent is high in a neighborhood already, like rent for another unit is going to be high in that neighborhood too. So I think, we just have not seen, what we're seeing in our city is massive increases in property value. I know that folks often in single family neighborhoods are scared that their home value will go down. And I get that, a lot of people have a lot invested in their home, literally. There's also a lot of stuff to unpack too. And I think we have to, confront head on, how people's views of renters differ from reality, or the underlying racial tones of a lot of fears that people have about rental housing. And that's a hard conversation to have, but one that I think is necessary if we're really going to meet our goals around race equity. And then I think, gentrification is a huge issue, and I think one that's really hard because we don't want to disinvest in communities in order to keep them affordable. And so I think this is an example of what's happening now in Minneapolis, probably lots of other cities. Right now, low-income neighborhoods people are getting priced out and moving to the suburbs because they're cheaper than the city. And there, often transportation isn't as accessible. A lot of other things aren't as accessible. So we have already seen things like developers buying up single family homes to rent a single family rental. As far as we can tell, that hasn't been exacerbated by the changes. But what has changed is that folks are able to, we have a similar program to Cambridge where we have a bunch of city-owned lots. It's a long story, but the city owns a bunch of single family lots. And we were selling them, folks were redeveloping single family homes, and now they're redeveloping them as triplexes. So the families who are able to buy those homes not only have a home to live in, but they have some rental income coming in because now they're able to build triplexes there. So I think there are actually a lot of success stories for folks getting pathways to homeownership and also pathways into building intergenerational wealth that are allowed through these kinds of zoning changes.
Yeah, no, super good questions. The piece about gentrification and lower income neighborhoods being concerned about development, I think, is something super sympathetic and understanding, where adding new housing goes along with more expensive prices, can lead to folks getting rent increases or evictions or those trends. And a big piece that I always try to include in these conversations, even though it's challenging in Massachusetts, where we have a lot of tenant protections banned, are rent stabilization, our just cause eviction, our tenant opportunity to purchase, to try to decouple development and displacement, so that if there's new housing going into your neighborhood, that doesn't mean your building is going to get sold and your lease is going to be up and you're going to be without a place to live. One of the things we worked on in Cambridge while I was a counselor was a condo conversion ordinance, so that if a rental building was being converted into condominiums, that folks living there would be able to keep living there for a year or more. If they had disabilities, 5 years, they would have to be paid by the owner up to $10,000 for relocation assistance for that first month's rent, for the security deposit, to think about those pieces. The development in building duplexes and triple deckers in the single family only, the whiter and wealthier neighborhoods, is really different, and sometimes the language gets confused, gets the development concerns get transposed in a way that doesn't make sense, and that's where thinking about community control and what we mean by that, I think, is super important. Community control means something really different for a Black and brown denser neighborhood than it means for a more suburban white single family only area. And in those cases, it's trying to show the benefits of density, of meaning that if you make an area no longer single family only, it doesn't mean anything has to happen with your property. It doesn't mean that no new single family homes can't be built. It just allows more diversity, and thinking about what kinds of housing and what kinds of diversity of housing, meaning diversity of people, and getting that across. And some of that's is always a challenge when we have a current sort of capitalist housing system where newer housing is more expensive housing unless it's affordable housing, and the sort of questions about who can live in it. But it's those conversations and that sort of intentional development. I think a lot comes with that community process and explanations, and ultimately organizing elections also.
And what role can community conversations play in helping to mitigate backlash that is prior to reforms, organizing experts, policymakers, and low-income renters to come in and have these discussions with the community, trying to address misinformation, etc., letting the community interact with people who would directly benefit, but also show individuals who are struggling, but are already part of the community. So, that wasn't necessarily a big question, but my comment is, you guys build these plans prior or in the midst of the pandemic. I think the pandemic has revealed things that we already knew, but exacerbated it to the point where we can no longer wait any longer. And so based on the pandemic, do you have anything in these plans that you wish you would have added or changed if you had the ability to do so today?
I mean, I think having this plan in place allowed us to very quickly implement changes that allowed us to be a lot more flexible and resilient during the pandemic. So we hadn't yet, but we're able to legalize single room occupancy housing so that when our hotels were vacant and we had an opportunity to partner with our county to fund shelter in hotels and vacant hotels, we had not yet, but we're able to really quickly adopt an ordinance that allowed for that. Same with that tiny homes village that we showed. I mean, it was a lot of work. We did over 200 community meetings over a couple of years, but that really did, I think that investment really paid off in huge spades, and really created a lot more resilience so that we were able to, shift as our community shifted. I wish we could have rent stabilization in place. We also have state law challenges. And honestly, that's not something that when I first took office, well, I would say I would not have necessarily supported rent control without the other changes that we have done in Minneapolis. I think rent control with building restriction, if you don't allow any housing to get built and you restrict rents, you're causing a really dysfunctional housing market that helps some people, but probably overall isn't really sustainable over time. But since we've allowed more development to come in and we're allowing development as of right, I think rent stabilization is a really important piece of that puzzle. So I think the community conversations are really important, but we've also had really good luck investing for our own staff in time to do data collection and really showing data to our community, all this data about racial disparities in housing, as well as our university. They did a study for us that really dove into what a rent stabilization policy could do in our city. And we might have different ideas about how far we should go. I personally would probably support a pretty moderate rent stabilization policy in our city that folks who would really want to push probably wouldn't say went far enough. But to me, I think, allowing folks who are investing in real estate to still make a profit, but to really crack down on price gouging, like huge increases in rent very suddenly, which we see in our lowest income communities, much like everything else. That to me is part of the puzzle. And, I think the stories, like the question asked, are so important. I mean, we heard from renters who had a job, could afford to pay rent, but weren't able to find an apartment because they had an eviction filing on their record. And so all of the work that we did around renter protections, limiting look back for evictions, limiting look back for criminal convictions, we still need to do more change at the state level to really protect people. But those were the direct result of hearing from renters telling us, hey, look, I have a job, I have enough money to pay rent, and I still can't find a place to live. And I think when you start to hear those stories, it starts to really cut across political divides or different approaches to housing, and it just becomes more like common sense to say, yeah, it does not make sense for somebody who can afford housing to be shut out because they had an eviction once 10 years ago. So I think both data and the stories are really important.
Jivan?
Yeah. The pieces around data and folks wondering if there's a new 30, 40 unit housing development going up in their neighborhood, is that going to lead to 40 new people trying to park on the street if it doesn't have parking, and having that data to say, like we have seen other developments here. When it's near transit, when it goes in, most of the people who move in do not have cars. That sometimes helps, doesn't always convince people, but I think is useful to be able to show and demonstrate. I think another piece that was interesting during the pandemic, especially when thinking about community engagement, was so many of our meetings, whether they were city council meetings or planning board meetings, switched to Zoom and allowed people to participate who might not otherwise be able to, who, our council meetings were at 5:30 p.m. on a Monday. And if you had commitments in the evening, if you had childcare responsibilities, you weren't able to make it in person, to give public comment or to just watch the meeting or to show up and support or oppose something. But if you can join by Zoom, it changes the possibility. Led to some long meetings in terms of, hundreds of people showing up and giving public comment by Zoom, but also really changed the diversity of who was able to. And so figuring out ways to get engagement in non-traditional ways. The city uses a platform called Co-Urbanize for developments that allows people to comment on developments in a pretty easy way. Thinking about methods like that, I think, is also important.
All right, and this will be the last question. To what degree did university and nonprofit partners participate in the Minneapolis 2040 plan? And to what degree were they willing to reassess the amount of payment or lieu of taxes they would contribute to municipal finances? This is a big issue in Providence, maybe in Cambridge too, that contributes to a number of budget challenges, especially as it pertains to education and city services. So Lisa, and then Jivan, if you want to add.
Our university is a land grant university, which means it's like our bossy big sister that has been around longer than the city itself. We do have we worked hard to have a really good relationship with the university, with our county, but at times that relationship has been strained. I think for us, we just took what we could that was positive from that relationship. We did hire the university to do studies, both of our minimum wage law as well as the rent control study that I mentioned. That was like the formal relationship that we had with them in terms of plan implementation. The process that we used for the 2040 plan was mostly very open. So we didn't have, like a steering committee of experts guiding the plan development. Certainly staff was meeting with stakeholders from the business community, from research community, but we really tried to keep it as flat and open as possible to get the broadest input that we could. But certainly business stakeholders, the university, our Federal Reserve Bank, local branch here, all participated as stakeholders.
And in Cambridge, the pilot issue often comes up. Two universities, Harvard and MIT, with very significant endowments who are tax exempt, and so figuring out how much they're going to contribute is an issue. And there's bills at the state legislature that would mandate a payment for their real estate, a portion of that going to the city in lieu of taxes. The other issue that comes up though in Cambridge and maybe in other cities as well is that housing for students, especially grad students, enrollment has really increased from Harvard and MIT in the past couple decades, but graduate housing hasn't kept pace. And so that's more people coming to live in Cambridge to attend university who are then competing on the private market for housing. And a lot of the housing that we have that are triple deckers that maybe have 3-4 bedrooms that were at one point had families in them are now, students or young people, including myself. That's the kind of housing I've lived in, that are each paying $800,000-$900,000 for a room, and driving up the price of housing. And if we can have universities building more graduate student housing, that's also going to contribute to that. And so when MIT recently got some new land, a big push from the council was to see how much of that we could be housing as opposed to just commercial space or university space. And so thinking about parts like that as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you. That's it for the Q&A. I want to thank these two amazing leaders for their contributions today, Lisa and Jivan. Amazing work in your respective communities, and that's going to transcend for many generations. Appreciate your work being a former elected official and understanding the importance of affordable housing. So I want to give both of you a big virtual round of applause and turn it back over to Jen.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, James, for moderating. Thank you so much, Lisa and Jivan, for answering our questions and sharing your stories. I personally find both of your work very inspirational, and can't wait now that I'm about to graduate from my MPA to take some of what I'm learning from you into Providence and other communities throughout Rhode Island. So first, thank you and hurrah. So tomorrow is the in-person part of the Get Housing Right conference. I know some of you folks who are online are going to join us in person tomorrow. It's going to be another gorgeous day, and I know I'm going to ask you to be inside on a gorgeous day, but it's going to be so worth it and so exciting. I thank you so much for your time, and I can't wait to see all of you later or tomorrow. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was amazing.
That was fantastic.
Thank you for having us. That was really fun.
Yeah, I'll say to both of you, so my husband is just about to announce that he's running for elected position here in the city. And so, yeah, I have, as you know, we've been talking in our house about, what the ideas going forward may be if you were to, get on city council. A lot of what you're talking about really excites me, and I hope that he gets that opportunity to both learn from you as well and bring some of those lessons here.
Thank you for having us. It was great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. And
I love hearing about Cambridge.
Yeah, no, it's super. I'd heard so much. I read so much about Minneapolis over the years.
Yeah, same.